Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of What's Happening. I'm George Binns, and we're now doing part two of the discussion with Jim Moducno over clean energy and electric transportation. Welcome back, Jim.
Well, thank you, George, for having me back for the second section. Looking forward to it. And again, thank you. Our first section, we covered a number of things in terms of what were the goals in terms of electric transportation. We talked about total cost, ownership type of issues,
One of the things,
charging stations.
One of the things that I guess you started off the first section with is a comparison between what different organizations claim as the savings using an electric vehicle. And in one case, I guess it was about was it $650 worth of gas, worth of electricity to drive 50,000 miles in a year. And then you made a calculation based on what an equivalent gasoline-powered car would be, and you're up around $1,200 a year for gas, and makes electric look good until you start to factor in, well, what exactly were they being charged for this electricity?
Correct.
It wasn't what you were going to pay in Massachusetts. And as the discussion went on, oh yeah, but it doesn't include the premium for buying wind power electric. And I think one of the things that came out of the discussion, I think we need to keep focused on, is people are presenting clean energy and electric transportation as the great savior. But
Correct.
They're not telling the whole story. And I think this is one of the things that people have to think about. Well, what else is involved in this? And how do we make this happen? So I think this is where we get into it a little more in electric transportation part two.
Yes, absolutely. And that's where we wanted to take it. So going into part two, one of the key things we want to talk about is we wanted to finish up on one section, which was talking about the reliability of energy sources. We want to cover that. And then I think we're going to go in the demographics of how that might impact the quest for all clean energy. And we'll talk about how there's rural America and there's urban America. Where are the batteries that are required for the EV made, and what are the risk factors associated with it? We're going to talk a little bit about the raw materials, and that's important because it's always important to know where they're coming from and what risk may be associated with them. And how will we handle the grid if we're all electric? How will cyber attacks, as well as potential electromagnetic pulse or EMP, as well as the geomagnetic disturbance, which is solar flares, GMD, impact our power supply and our quality of life going forward? So those are the things we want to do, and then we'll wrap it up, okay? I'm going to take that down, George. There we go.
Yep.
All righty. So let's start where we finished off last section. And I think the most important thing when I look at this is when you rely on solar power and wind power, it's really truly a risky proposition. We talked about wind farms that are typically oftentimes located hundreds of miles from the user. They could be offshore. They could be like in the Texas example this past year, where the bottom line is they had a big ice storm. Those windmills were down, and a lot of people didn't have power for weeks on end. So we want to look at that. And we also want to talk about with wind farms, there's an enormous amount of investment in terms of transmission lines. And we talked a little bit about that, especially with ocean transmission lines. And then we want to talk about also, what do you need to do in terms of, if everybody's going electric, do we have enough? Do we have enough power generation today from solar, from even the structure we have today? If you just go solar and you go wind power, we're definitely going to be challenged. And in reading one of the reports, it stated, the power companies that stated, we're going to have to build 25% more capacity needs to be built in the form of power plants, new transmission lines, and infrastructure costs will be high, and they need to be able to do that. Now, how long does it take to build plants? Well, building power plants can take anywhere from 5 to 10 years getting them off the drawing board. And also, when you think about all the output and the transmission upgrades and the new infrastructure, you're really looking at 10 to 15 years of infrastructure expenditures. And then I asked the question to myself and to everybody is, who's going to pay for all this?
Well, I think the other question comes in is when you say there's an additional 25% in capacity that is needed, does that assume that all the existing sources of electricity still stay online? Or is this 25% to replace?
This is 25% more capacity.
So it really doesn't solve the so-called problem of carbon dioxide emissions because everything that's online and producing is still needed. We can't do without it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's another one of these, didn't tell you the whole story.
I think if we wanted a preview of how this could work out for everybody, I think just watching what California has been doing the last 3 to 4 or 5 years, where they constantly have rolling brownouts as well as blackouts when the weather gets hot, which is really, California's hot in some of those areas, right? It's a yearly event now. We saw the windmills in Texas. So there are examples out there that we need to be, they're risk factors and need to be addressed if we're going to be able to do that. So let's talk a little bit about demographics, George. It's interesting. 97% of America is classified as being rural areas. And only 3% of that is really classified as urban or really city environments per se on a bigger scale. And yet 20% of the people, or about 65 to 70 million people, live in these rural regions. And 80% of the population is living in urban areas. So it might work if you live in a big city like Boston. Do you need a car if you're in Boston? You can take the train, you can take the subway, you can take an Uber, you can do whatever you want. You can walk maybe, who knows, right? But we've seen what the impact is of living in the big cities when you have something like a COVID-19 and breakout and so forth. It really does impact. So looking at that, how do people in the rural area is one of the big questions. They travel a whole lot more miles to get to stores and places to get around. If you think about the rural areas and you think about the cities being the hubs, think about traveling across the country if you were trying to travel on electricity. So your challenges would be to find those sources to be able to work for them. Large populated cities can probably do this green thing with no problem. But you get out in the rural areas, you're really stressing people in that project. How do you do that?
Well, I think one of the things that even when you start to talk about the situation in the city, MBTA is continually losing money because they cannot develop the ridership because they really don't service the city very well. You look at the MBTA and it's a spider web. You got all these rail lines radiating out from the center of the city. But to make a connection, you got to go all the way into Boston and then come all the way out again. So, we've got the highways, 128 and now 495, that are circumurban routes that carry you around the city and theoretically allow you to make connections between the rail lines, but the connections really aren't there.
Yeah, and if you think about rural areas, if you look at where our power plants are located, they tend to be located closer to the urban areas where the mass amount of people are located and where the highest energy consumption is going to be occurring. So if you're urban and you're living out there, if you're living in urban, that's fine. if you're in a rural area, you're in the country, then, the transmission lines to get out with all that energy they needed are just going to continue to be there. That requirement's going to continue to grow. And when we talk about the new plants and the transmission lines, you and I both know by looking at our electric bills, it all falls on our shoulders. And that's going to be one of the biggest challenges in terms of the cost of ownership. And when you think about the cost of ownership, we need to ask the question, is electric power clean? And I think it's, off the top, everybody you read and go to the sites, they're indicating to you, oh yeah, it's very, very clean. But they're thinking you're using all wind and you're using all solar. But the reality is there's more things that create what I call dirty air, right, for people than just thinking about the energy as being one source. Let's talk about the batteries. The batteries in these cars are huge. They go from about 600 pounds to 1,200 pounds in some of the vehicles. And when you look at them, you ask the question, and I asked right away is, okay, where are the batteries all made? And doing the research came back with 75% of the batteries today for electric vehicles are produced in China. In China. That's 75% of the volume today.
Well, China has 95% of the rare earths that you need to make batteries.
They have yes, they do. I was going to say
So even if you make a battery someplace else, you still got to buy the materials from China.
That's absolutely in the equation. So if you look at it, China dominates the battery producing manufacturing today. They have with 93 what they call gigafactories that manufacture lithium-ion battery cells versus only 4 are located in the United States, and Tesla owns one of them. And that's according to the benchmark of Minerals Intelligence. Going forward also, China is projecting to have 140 gigafactories by 2030, while Europe will have 17, the United States will have just about 10. So again, even though we're going to be building some, our dependency is going to be on China.
Well, one of the other myths that comes out of this, and we call all these materials rare earths, implying that they're not very far, not many places have them. But in reality, there are sources of these rare earths within the United States. Mm-hmm. And our latest government decided that, no, we don't want to get into mining because that's a dirty word. And so even though we know we're going to be set up for essentially we're getting a stranglehold by the Chinese on a lot of things, including batteries, we have an opportunity to become self-sufficient, and it's going to go the way of the oil. Excuse me.
God bless you.
I got a cold.
You're absolutely correct there, George.
At the same time. Anyway, so the United States developed fracking and became self-sufficient in oil.
Correct.
What we're doing is shutting it down. We're doing the same thing with the opportunity to become self-sufficient in batteries.
Yes, absolutely. They absolutely are. We're outsourcing everything we have to a country like China, who is really it's a communist state, right? Yeah. Chinese Communist Party runs the whole thing. So we're really depending on China in the future based on how we're approaching this thing at this moment in time. So if you look at it, how's China going to get all the power they need for all those mega factories? Well, they're building 128 new coal burning. So the way I kind of look at that is we can do all this on electric, and it's good to have clean air and water and earth, and I'm all for it. But the bottom line is we're not going to move the needle at all if CO2 was an issue in the atmosphere, because China is taking care of everything for us. Whatever we're saving, they're tripling it or 10 times it on the other end. And it's just not logical.
It's China, it's India, because they're also producing. If you look at the numbers over the next 10, 15 years, they're talking about thousands of coal-fired plants between China and India. The 128 you mentioned, that's currently in process.
Yep.
And they're not going to stop there. And basically, it comes down to the fact that I guess the Chinese people and the Indian people want the same kind of style of living that we have here. It's based on electricity.
Right. And
They get it the same way we got it.
yep, exactly. They're doing their own industrial revolution, so to speak, George.
Yeah.
And and somehow, when I look at this, I get a little edgy on it, because when you do look at uh, the things we're doing, we're talking like the Biden administration. I was just reading this the other day, is planning on utilizing more electric military vehicles. I'll just leave it at there, hang it out. It's sort of the word that comes to mind for me is like insane, right?
Yeah.
But going green is a wonderful thing, I guess. When you talk those raw materials we were talking about, George, I mean, some of the items that are needed for it is the copper, the nickel, the lithium. And if you look at the copper production, Chile, Peru, Mexico, Indonesia are places where they have a lot, as well as obviously China. Nickel, Indonesia, Philippines, Russia, right?
Yeah.
Australia and Brazil. The lithium is basically China's there. They're big. Australia, Argentina, and Bolivia, right? Believe it or not. And yet we have some in our country, but to your point, George, we have all these things in our country, but we won't mine them.
Yeah. And
that's
it's
because
that we have developed.
Yeah, we're being it's like we're going to be just customers for China and everything. Other components, 74% of all the other components that are necessary to make the actual lithium batteries and for the cars is all that manufacturing is in China today, believe it or not. So it leaves you like 26% is outside of that area. In the end, battery manufacturing, right, is highly dependent on dirty energy, as in the coal plants, right, that are needed for the gigafactories. So yes, we're going to be clean here, but not really, right?
Yeah.
And then let's talk a little bit about some other things that we talked about. The batteries have about an 8 to 10 year life. The cost of replacing a battery is somewhere in the vicinity of about between $4,000 and $16,000. And then you're going to add in anywhere from $1,000 to $3,000 for the labor to pull it out and reinstall a new one. So are they affordable? As you start adding the cost, I'm not so sure they're as affordable as we think. The average sticker price of a new car, electric car, is on average $19,000 more expensive than a gasoline powered car. That's a pretty steep price. If you're rich and you can afford a Tesla, I think you're okay, right? But if you're just an average working person like myself and others, that's a big expense to be for this, right? So
the other one too is here in the city of Beverly. There was an announcement a couple of months ago that the city leased an electric school bus.
Yeah,
they got a good deal because they got it for the same $24,000 a year they would have had to pay for a diesel-powered school bus. It was such a good deal, they got another one. And along the line, they mentioned, oh, by the way, an electric school bus is about twice the price of a diesel-powered one.
Yep.
So instead of paying $250,000 for a diesel bus, it cost $500,000. Well, you start to do some numbers, like you say, okay, the company that owns this diesel bus and it's leasing it to Beverly is getting $24,000 a year. And like you said, that the life expectancy of the battery is 6 to 10 years. I've seen some different numbers. But to keep the arithmetic simple, in the course of 10 years of operation, they will get $240,000, which is about the price of a diesel bus. Where's the extra money coming from for the electric thing? Oh, nobody mentions that.
Exactly.
It's subsidized. And it's coming out of my back pocket and your back pocket and everybody else's as somebody else's taxes that get redirected. And you start to think about the total cost of these things, and that nobody is really addressing total cost. these things are not an economically viable alternative. And if you had to pay the whole bill in one fell swoop, you'd turn your nose up and walk away from it. But
Absolutely.
because it appears like you get some magic money, it's a good deal.
Yeah, I mean, we put our blinders on when we talk about environmental issues. That's what we do. We put it on. We don't use any logic behind everything, and that's really not a good thing. So one of the things that we also ought to think about going forward is really to think in terms of all the risk factors that are associated with things. If you remember, the Colonial Pipeline was hacked, right, by ransomware.
Yep.
You saw what it did to that whole pot, and that was just gasoline, and yet 2/3 of the country still had plenty of supply of gasoline. Imagine what would happen if we're all electric and the grid goes down because of ransomware, a cyber attack from an unfriendly nation. You can pick one. We got plenty of those, right? To go. That would be unbelievable. Our infrastructure that we have for our power lines easily is not as good as what it needs to be. I think we've been talking about it for 30 years. There's been some improvement, but it's not. We're probably 30 years from even upgrading it to where we need it. So I don't understand what they're talking about. And then there's other factors that can go. I mean, terrorists could take down your line, right? Strategically placed disruptions of certain power stations and power plants in certain areas, bang, you're down, right? And the other thing to keep in mind is that if, God forbid, I mean, and you got to keep in mind that there's something called, if you had a weapon or a nuclear weapon that was exploded 100 miles above the earth, in terms of near the United States over its continental North America, you would get what they call the electromagnetic pulse, which would definitely disrupt and damage not only the grid, but the electronics are like all the relays and the switching and circuit breakers are along the whole line. And it can also damage that same thing in your car because our cars we don't build them to withstand that type of energy. The military's been doing that and starting to do more of it. But you need like a Faraday cage to protect it. And your car just doesn't do the trick, right, at this moment of time. I took a quote from Duke Energy spokesperson, Catherine Butler. She said the study that was put in place, the respective some of the hyper holes, what they call in help utilities, come to common understanding about what the real threats are. They're beginning to understand what the threats are, and they're trying. She's saying EMP being one, cyber threats are another. Storms are always a threat to the power line in the grid. And so you look at that, and then we look at what the sun could do to us in terms of what we call a severe geomagnetic disturbance, which is a solar flare. And we've seen them on occasion. We haven't had some really big ones, but I was looking at the data, and quite a few years ago, there was a big one that disrupted the earth. And then you look at it, even a guy like President Trump, when he was in office, recognized that by executive order, he directed the cabinet leaders to coordinate efforts to address EMP impact to the grid.
The thing I think that bothers me most, there's a very good book written not too long ago called The Perfect Weapon. And essentially what that is a hack attack on the grid.
Yep.
And Russia has been doing it to the Ukraine for years. And
yes.
It's not something that's a theoretical or pie in the sky or somebody
it's real
having a bad dream. These have happened, and it's a really fatal event because if you look at what happens when the grid goes down, everything comes to a halt.
Yes.
Nobody's growing food in their backyard. The deliveries to the store stop, and it becomes a massive fatal event. And to continually ignore these things, that's the scary part about it. And it's a combination in my mind of ignoring serious issues like a hack attack on the grid or an EMP attack. And Canada lost their grid for quite some time, several years ago, with a solar storm that just followed the magnetic field of the Earth right down on top of all this stuff. They couldn't handle it. And, we've had serious events before, but nationwide, it's devastating. And people are treating it very casually, and they're worrying about, well, can we reduce the carbon content of something or other? Guys, there are some serious problems in this world that they're not being addressed. And on top of that, people just don't want to recognize that they're not getting the whole story. And I think this is one of the points I think you've been making all along, that there are other events and other implications of doing some of this stuff that just don't get broadcast. And we're down to the last couple of minutes, so what's your take on it?
Well, my conclusion on this whole thing is similar, in the sense that I look at our government and I say they're not very good at addressing issues of infrastructure that impact us today. What are they going to do going forward? How are they going to start working on bigger issues? Government is not always the answer, and they're trying to. When I look at the programs, even the Resilient Together program, as well as the TCI that Baker's trying to push, all of it is government trying to force us into a hyper hole where all we got is electric energy type of thing, in terms of electric cars and everything else. And I think that's a major risk. It's they approach all these problems like it was political theater. That's what they do, George. I mean, they've taken clean energy requirements and just turned it into a political advantage for them. I look at it in our local, our mayor, I look at the governor of our state. They all think green first, and they don't care what it costs or how it impacts us as individuals. I think it's a fool's errand we're on.
Yeah, so
I got solar panels on my house, and I believe in clean earth, air, and water, but I think you can do it smartly, and I don't think we're doing it smartly.
Yeah, and I think my concern is that we're only getting part of the story that makes us sound good, and we're ignoring the other half of the problem. And like the situation we're in right now with the grid, it is vulnerable that it can be hacked and shut down. And is somebody worrying about that? Is somebody doing something about that?
Nope.
I think it's no. And yeah, Trump tried to make a change, but as soon as Biden gets in, he undoes everything Trump tried to do, regardless of whether it's valuable or not. So this is not a way to run the government.
No, it isn't.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've had a fun time for half an hour.
We did.
Second of the series of shows that Jim has provided with the information. And thanks for joining us. And as I mentioned at every show, my email address shows up in the credits. If you've got a different comment or you would like to comment, be on the show, send me an email and we can make it happen. Thanks again for watching and have fun.